Hey, what's up? I'm Pabi Moloi. You're watching Joburg Today.
The city of Johannesburg has emerged as the most popular destination in Africa in 2016. This according to the Mastercard Global Destination Cities Index. In fact, recently, the National Department of Tourism and the Gauteng Tourism Authority has launched a massive campaign to further enhance tourism growth in the province. This initiative involves a whopping 50 million rand being pumped into recruiting 200 unemployed youth for training in the tourism industry. The province is displaying a further commitment to beefing up security in the process and ensure that visitors keep coming to our beautiful city. Now, this initiative was launched in the iconic Vilakazi Street in Soweto, Johannesburg. The recent Mastercard Cities Index clearly indicates that Johannesburg is doing exceptionally well in tourism growth already. To discuss, I'm joined in studio by Anton Van Der Merwe, Head of Market Development at Mastercard Southern Africa. Welcome.
Thank you.
Great to have you with us. Looking at your index, the results for 2016 is very impressive. If you look at the numbers, Johannesburg as a city ranks pretty awesome in Africa.
It's fantastic news for Johannesburg. And what the survey, if I can just talk about how we do this survey,
Sure.
is we look at inbound visitors to a city, and then we also look at the spend of those visitors in a city. So Johannesburg, out of the 13 cities in Africa that made the list, is top. And from a global perspective, 132 cities that were surveyed, Johannesburg is in the 30th spot. So it's in the top 30 cities globally, which I think is a fantastic accolade for the city.
Absolutely, big time. How do you go about compiling the data to ensure accuracy on your side?
So there are a few things that we feed into the research. The one is overnight visitors. So for that, we look at tourism statistics as well as other national data that is available around that. And we look at overnight stay. So a visitor to a city mustn't be in transit, so they're stopping here, but they're actually on transit to the Kruger Park or something like that. So they have to have had an overnight stay in Johannesburg. And the second thing is we look at spend data. There's national spend data that does exist at Reserve Bank, etc., that talks about the cash spend and the card spend, a forex spend that does take place. So those two things feed into the survey.
Sure. If I look at your survey, it indicates that Joburg improved from 2015 by growing in international expenditure by 4%. So would it be fair to say when the mayor of Joburg says if Johannesburg works, South Africa will work? Is that a fair statement on his part?
It's a fair statement, and you're spot on. So the value of having tourists and visitors to a city, and you look at that 4% growth, I think if we look at ourselves as South Africans, our spend is probably plateaued. You know, we're not really spending a lot because our disposable income is fairly restricted, especially over the last 18 months. So the importance of seeing that 4% lift in spend, and it was, I think the total was around $2.5 billion US, is that tourism and spend has a knock-on impact. You know, so restaurants need to order food from somewhere. There's transport involved in getting that food to the restaurant. So the job creation spin-off in and around the city, that it does have that knock-on impact, is important. So great for Johannesburg to see that. I think GDP growth was around 0.3%.
Yeah, 0.3%.
Yeah, and if you look at that 4%, you know, it's a good way to make sure that you can sort of drive the economic activity in a city. The other important thing is maybe just to mention that around 50% of people are living in cities. So when you look at the future, that's where the economy is going to be driven from. It's around cities. And then the other interesting thing is how people are spending when they do come to a city. You know, so if you look at the spend that does take place, it's around leisure. 75% to 80% is what people spend is for leisure. So in leisure, it's shopping, it's accommodation, it's dining out, etc. So there's been a shift. When people are going to cities, it's for tourism reasons, not so much business reasons. And if you look at the highest growing cities globally, it's around tourism and leisure spend, not so much business. So there's maybe a shift towards business where business takes place via Skype, via emails, etc. Visitors to a city will probably increase in terms of it's for leisure and tourism. So those are some of the positive signs I think that Joburg can take from a planning perspective.
So it's certainly a city of choice for international travelers, Johannesburg,
Yes.
from a leisure perspective,
From a
as you
leisure
say.
perspective, yes. And if I qualify that, is just the origination countries which we look at when we do the survey is most of the visitors to Johannesburg are from the Middle East Africa. So 78% of visitors are from the continent, of which the majority come from our surrounding countries. So, you know, Mozambique, it's Zimbabwe, it's Lesotho, Swaziland, etc. So the message there is simply that Johannesburg as a hub is becoming an economic hub from a tourism perspective. And if you think about these countries, they're not a long haul flight. It's quite easy to get you. And then the other positive thing that it probably tells us is that the retailers and the scope of variety that we've got when it comes to shopping, the quality and price is still very good, and that's what Joburg offers, more than what you would get back at a home country. So people come shop here and then they
So the
they
weaker
go
rand
back.
is serving us.
Absolutely, absolutely.
We talked about the 2016 results and looked at the 4% jump from 2015, but give us a sense of how Johannesburg has been improving over the years as a city of choice, as for international tourists. Are we seeing a sustained growth?
Yes, I think if you look at the history, it's always good because it gives you a bit of a trend. But in number of visitors, Johannesburg grew by 24%. So from 3.7 to 4.6. Now, even if Johannesburg does grow off a lower base next year and the year after, it's going to be growing off a higher base. So it's always good to, I think, compare it to another city. So if you take Cape Town, and you take some of the other cities in Africa that made that list, is Cape Town had 1.5 million visitors. Joburg had 4.6 million visitors. So the gap between Cape Town and Joburg, and Cape Town was second on the list, they moved from third to second. The gap between Joburg and the second biggest city in Africa, which is Cape Town, is still massive. So the signs are all good in terms of that, even if it's off a lower percentage, the number of visitors in real numbers will still continue into the next few years.
Well, it's great to see so much of appetite for Johannesburg. How is East Africa doing as a matter of interest? We know growth in tourism has been quite strong in East Africa. How does that compare to the growth that we are seeing here in this region?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to talk about South Africa a little bit, because if we talk about East Africa, we can also compare it to South Africa as a country. But if you look at the top 5 cities, there is no East African city that forms part of that top 5. So I think it starts off Joburg, Cape Town, Lagos, Casablanca, then Cairo. And then in 6th place is Durban.
Okay.
And then it's Nairobi, and then other cities that follow. So South Africa, if you've got 3 cities in the top 6, for us as a country, it's a very positive sign. I think that 60% of all visitors out of all the cities in Africa, 60% of them are coming to South Africa. So that's Joburg with the majority, then Cape Town, and then Durban. Those 6 cities account for 3 cities account for 60% of all visitors into Africa.
I think what's also interesting to point out is that Johannesburg is part of the Gauteng province, which is geographically the smallest province in the country as well.
Yes.
What would you say, if you can gauge from the findings of this index, what would you say are the big draw cards for Johannesburg?
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned earlier on, from a shopping perspective, there's so much variety in terms of retail stores and shops. If you look at accommodation, which is around 15% of total spend is accommodation, 15% is on dining out, so eating out. So a variety of restaurants, accommodation, shops. And then the other thing that probably counts in Joburg's favour is that there's a lot of events and festivals that take place in Joburg. And they must be drawing some of the visitors. You know, if I think of the Joy of Jazz Festival, that type of thing. And then you've got the Lion Park, and you've got, Gold Reef City. Those attractions do attract visitors. Now, I think the good example of a global city that's got it right is Dubai. You know, Dubai is in a desert. You know, there isn't really much if you think about it, but yet what they've done with the city in terms of the festivals, the attractions, and catering for tourists and visitors has been done really, really well. So that's something that we can learn from, a city we can learn from as Johannesburg, is to make sure that those things are in place. And then one thing that we need to probably work on is the transport system. So if you're a tourist and you arrive at an airport, you want to be able to get on a bus or a train or a taxi, and it should be seamless. You don't want to have to worry about how am I going to get from point A to B. And all the fastest growing cities also have a very good transit system in place, you know, London, Paris, etc.
Sure.
And that's something that Johannesburg should probably focus on and put more focus on going into the future.
Sounds fantastic. What else can you share with us about the findings of this index that actually shares or gives more insight to cities' growth in Africa? What else is this index used for?
Yeah, so cities should use it for planning purposes. So if your inflowing visitors are the numbers that they are, you need to make sure that you cater from a security perspective for the influx of visitors, because obviously more visitors, you know, there's a chance that they would be targeted. So you have to have good security in place. The transit system I spoke about is very important. You know, so those are what the smart cities ensure, you know, that there's an element of safety, people feel safe. So if you're planning ahead, you've got to make sure infrastructure is in place. There's something that escapes my mind that might come back to me just now that I thought was specifically relevant to Joburg. But I think those are the main things.
Sure.
And it's really an index that the city should be using to plan for the future. I mentioned earlier on something like 50% of people live in cities now, but by the year 2050, it's going to be 70% of a country's population will be living in cities. So how do you use that and plan for job creation going into the future is quite important.
So would you say that the results are a fair gauge of how perception has shifted when it comes to issues of crime in the city of Johannesburg?
Yeah, so I think unfortunately we have the one or two incidences that do take place. But if you look at cities globally, you do have incidences, you know, where tourists are robbed and so on. I think my first trip to London 20 years ago, within the first 3 hours, I witnessed 2 robberies that took place. It's unfortunate, but hopefully those are isolated incidences, and it didn't influence my perception of the city. I saw it, it was my first day there, and I think people realize that you do have these incidences, but they're not the norm. You know, and the growth in visitor numbers is indicative of people are not influenced by necessarily the 1 or 2 incidences that do take place. It doesn't mean we don't have to address them, we definitely do. But I think we sometimes hype up those incidences more than what they really are. And the trend is still very positive.
I mentioned an initiative that was launched by the Department of Tourism in partnership with the Gauteng Tourism Authority. A commendable initiative to beef up security by employing tourism monitors or tourism ambassadors. It shows how serious the government is to promote the tourism sector in the country. What are your thoughts around these efforts?
I think it's critical. There are other initiatives like the Tsepo 1 million and Harambee that are trying to create employment for the mass unemployed that currently, you know, live in Johannesburg. And tourism is a way to drive that, and any initiative around tourism will create jobs. And you know, going back to Dubai, it's you know, the UAE is based on oil, but oil eventually runs out. So they're building towards a future where you can create jobs through visitor inflow. And that's, I think, you know, similar to us in Gauteng, to your point earlier on, small province, but you know, as minerals over time start to run out, tourism is the thing that will create jobs for you know, this generation, the generation thereafter. So I think it's very positive. Yeah.
Anton, thank you so much for your time today, for your feedback, for greater insight on this index, and for sharing this good news with us. Thank you.
Thank you.